If you are sitting on a £350,000 family home and £50,000 tucked away in ISAs, you are one needs assessment away from losing every penny of it to the council. Not half. All of it. Most people believe there is a safety net waiting for them called a deferred payment agreement, one that lets them keep the house no matter how long care lasts. At the interest rate set for the second half of 2026, 4.65%, compounding on a care bill of £1,300 a week, 5 years in a care home does not just eat into your equity. It builds a debt of more than £400,000, and the council collects that debt from the sale of your home. Here is the part almost nobody tells you before you sign anything. That agreement can end up costing your family more than doing nothing at all, and the reason comes down to timing, not paperwork. This is the real answer to the question people search for late at night: how do you actually protect assets from care home fees in 2026? I have watched this happen to people who did everything right. They saved for 40 years, paid off the mortgage, kept every receipt, and they still ended up asking how a lifetime of careful saving can disappear inside a single care home stay. Today I am going to walk you through the 3 specific assets your local council is allowed to look at first, and the 7-day window that causes most families to lose their protection without ever realizing it slipped past them. If you have spent your life building something to hand down, and you are not willing to let a threshold that has not moved since 2010 take it from you, hit subscribe. We are keeping Gen X legacies intact, one family at a time. Here is the number that decides everything, and almost nobody knows it exists until they need it. In England, the upper capital limit for care funding sits at £23,250. That figure has not moved since 2010. In the same stretch of time, the average cost of nursing care has climbed to £1,267 a week, according to Age UK's 2026 figures. Cross that £23,250 line, and the council stops paying. It does not matter if it is £24,000 or £2,400,000. Once your assets sit above that line, you are classed as what the system calls a self-funder, and a self-funder covers the full cost alone. That line has stayed frozen for 16 years while care costs kept climbing every single year, which means more ordinary families cross it now than ever did before. Here is the piece that surprises people even after they think they understand the rules. A deferred payment agreement sounds like the solution. The council lets you defer the fees and takes the money later from your estate, once the house is sold. But the council charges interest on that loan, and from the 1st of July 2026, that rate sits at 4.65% a year, according to Essex County Council and gov.uk guidance that every local authority follows. Run the numbers on a typical stay. Weekly residential care at £1,300. 4 years in care under a deferred payment agreement. And the debt against your home, once you add the compounding interest and the administration fees, reaches roughly £305,000. If house prices stay flat over those 4 years, most of what you thought you were protecting is already gone before anyone sells anything. This is the trade-off nobody explains up front. Deferring the payment does not protect your estate. It protects your cash flow while you are alive and quietly transfers the cost, plus interest, onto whatever your children were expecting to inherit. The bill does not disappear. It moves and it grows while it waits. Every year that passes without a plan is another year of interest, working against your family instead of for them. Age UK's own reporting this year points to a rising number of self-funders precisely because that £23,250 threshold has been frozen so long. More families are paying the full rate for longer without realizing there was ever a different path available to them. That 4.65% rate is not fixed for the life of the agreement either. The government reviews it every the 1st January and the 1st July, tracking gilt yields set by the Office for Budget Responsibility, so the exact cost of deferring can move again before your 5 years are anywhere near up. Sign today, and you are agreeing to a rate that can climb before the debt is even close to being settled. But before the council ever gets near your house, there is another asset they look at first, one that is far easier for them to reach and far faster for them to count. The second thing a council looks at, usually before they ever mention the house, is what is sitting in your ISAs and your premium bonds. To you, that money feels separate from the bricks and mortar. To the means test, it is simply capital, counted pound for pound alongside everything else you own. I used to tell people that premium bonds were a quiet place to keep money the council would never notice. I was wrong, and I want to correct that here. HMRC and local authorities share financial data far more closely than they used to, and in 2026 there is no realistic way to keep a savings pot hidden from a needs assessment. Here is the window almost every guide skips over. Most advice tells you to plan years in advance. The truth for most families is that the single most important stretch is the 7 days right after a spouse passes away, before probate starts moving and before anyone has properly reviewed what is now sitting in one name instead of two. Get that window wrong, and options close that were open the week before. There is a squeeze happening here too, and it explains why ISAs matter more than people think. With the full new state pension now at £241.30 a week, most of the personal allowance is already used up by the pension alone. ISA interest is one of the few pots of money left that is not taxed as income, right up until a care assessment looks at the ISA itself and counts the whole balance as a resource you are expected to spend down. So the instinct kicks in. Empty the ISA, hand the money to your children, and let the balance disappear before anyone comes looking. That single move is exactly what triggers a deprivation of assets investigation. And once a council believes you gave money away specifically to avoid care fees, they can assess you as if you still had it, even though it is long gone from your account. There is no fixed cut-off date that makes a gift automatically safe either. A council can look back years if they believe the intent was to avoid a bill, and intent gets judged by what you did at the time, not by how you explain it afterwards. A gift made the same month as a diagnosis reads very differently to a social worker than money you had already been giving your children for a decade before anyone got ill. If you own your home as joint tenants, you and your partner do not each own a defined half. You own the whole thing together, and when one of you needs care, the entire property can be counted as capital before the council even asks a follow-up question. The advice that circulates most often says the fix is simple. Switch to tenants in common, split the ownership into 2 separate 50% shares, and your share is protected the moment your partner goes into care. For one family in particular, that advice held up for exactly half the story. Take a couple, David and Susan, aged 64 and 62. Years before either of them needed care, they severed the joint tenancy specifically to protect half the house, following advice that sounded solid at the time. Then, in 2026, they both developed health conditions within months of each other. Here is where the split ownership actually works the way it was designed to. If only David needs residential care, his half share gets valued on its own. And because nobody wants to buy half a house with someone still living in the other half, that share is typically discounted somewhere between 10% and 15% against the open market value. The council counts that discounted figure, not the full value of half the house. But when both partners need care within a similar window, the protection built into that structure collapses. The council can place a charge against the full property, not against 2 separate halves, because both owners now have a care need, and neither can rely on the other still living in the home to justify the discount. In dual care scenarios, tenants in common does not fail sometimes. It fails as a protection strategy every time it is tested this way, because the entire premise depended on one partner staying at home. That is the invisible cost nobody mentions when they hand out this advice as a blanket rule. It works well for the single care scenario, and it offers close to nothing extra once both partners are affected, which is exactly the situation getting more common as couples age together into their late 60s and 70s. The discount itself only exists because a half share is genuinely hard to sell while someone still lives in the other half. A buyer has to accept a stranger next door, so they pay less to take that on. Once both halves belong to people who need care, that whole justification disappears, and the council can treat the property as one asset again, exactly as if the paperwork splitting it had never been signed. There is, however, one legal way to reduce what is counted against you that the council does not fight, because they actually built the rule for it. Most people are simply too nervous to use it properly. It is infuriating to watch a neighbour who never put a penny aside get their care paid for in full, while you are billed £1,500 a week for doing the responsible thing for 40 years. You are not being greedy for wanting to keep the home you built. You are being the person who looked after your family's future when it would have been easier not to. That anger is not a reason to panic and start moving money around badly. It is a reason to spend differently, not to hide anything. The CARE Act 2014 guidance is built around a test of intent versus effect, and it looks at why money left your account, not simply that it did. Paying off the remaining balance on your mortgage is rarely flagged as deprivation of assets, because it is treated as clearing a debt, not giving away capital. The same goes for repairing a roof that was genuinely failing, or replacing a boiler that had already broken down. A council assessor is not looking to catch you for keeping your own house in good repair. Even a prepaid funeral plan, typically running somewhere between £4,000 and £6,000, tends to sit comfortably outside the deprivation rules, because it is treated as reasonable future planning rather than an attempt to dodge a bill. The pattern that gets flagged is different. It is the gift made the same month as a diagnosis, with no history of giving money away before that point, and no other explanation for where the balance went. Intent is read from timing and pattern, not from a single transaction in isolation. Think about it the way you would any other bill in your life: a council tax payment, a car insurance renewal, a GP prescription charge. Nobody accuses you of dodging tax when you pay those on time. The same logic applies here. Spending your own money on your own home or your own future funeral is not evasion. It only starts to look like evasion when the paper trail disappears and the timing lines up too neatly with a new diagnosis. So the honest version of protecting your money is not clever concealment. It is documented, reasonable spending on things you would have paid for anyway, recorded well enough that nobody has to take your word for it later. But wanting more than the council's standard placement introduces its own trap, one that catches families who thought they were simply choosing somewhere nicer. There is a fully funded option that most families never even apply for, and when they do apply, most still do not get it. NHS Continuing Healthcare covers the full cost of care when a health need is judged to be the main reason someone needs support. According to NHS England's own data from the start of 2026, only around 17 in every 100 applicants are approved the first time they apply. The test that decides this is called the Primary Health Need Assessment, and it is stricter than most families expect. Dementia, even advanced dementia, is very often classified as a social care need rather than a healthcare need, which means the family pays privately instead of the NHS picking up the bill. The condition is genuinely serious. The classification simply decides who writes the check. It was not always this hard to qualify. A decade ago, just over 31% of applicants were approved under the same test. That share has fallen every year since, not because the rules changed on paper, but because the bar for what counts as complex or unpredictable enough has quietly moved higher in practice. Even when continuing healthcare is turned down, a smaller payment called NHS-funded nursing care, worth £267.68 a week in 2026, can still apply if a registered nurse is providing part of your care. It helps, but it covers only a fraction of a typical bill. Knowing this changes how you should treat an application. Treat it as worth checking because it costs nothing to ask and the amount at stake is real. Do not treat it as your backup plan because for roughly 4 out of every 5 families who apply, it is not what ends up paying the bill. An eligibility decision is not always final either. Around 1 in 6 decisions that get formally challenged are overturned at the first stage of appeal, which tells you the assessment carries real judgment calls, not just a fixed checklist. If breaking down rules like this is useful to you as you navigate 2026, subscribe. This channel exists for people trying to make sense of a system that rarely explains itself clearly the first time. 3 steps make the biggest difference here, and none of them require a solicitor to get started. First, check the land registry title deeds for your own home. It costs £3 online, and it tells you in minutes whether you are registered as joint tenants or tenants in common. Most people have never actually looked, and the answer changes what protection is even available to you. Second, remember the 12-week rule. For the first 12 weeks of a permanent care home stay, the value of your home must be disregarded from the means test, regardless of what a council representative suggests on day 1. Do not sign a deferred payment agreement in week 1, when the 12-week disregard is already doing that job for you at no interest cost at all. Third, document every significant spend as it happens, not months later when someone asks about it. I keep a blue folder in my own desk labeled Home Maintenance. Every invoice for the last 5 years sits inside it. If a social worker ever asked why my savings dropped by £10,000 back in 2024, I would hand over the invoice for the double glazing that year, dated and itemized, instead of trying to explain it from memory. That folder is not about hiding anything. It is about being able to prove, instantly, that money left your account for a reason the rules were always going to respect. 3 habits, kept up over years rather than days, do more to protect a family home than any single clever move made at the last minute. You cannot stop the council from running a needs assessment, and you cannot argue your way around a threshold that has sat at £23,250 since 2010. What you can control is whether you understand the mechanics before you are standing in that meeting, not after. Know what a 4.65% deferred payment agreement actually costs over years, not just in the first month. Know that the week after a spouse passes away can matter more than the 5 years before it. And pay attention to which everyday choices, how you spend, when you gift money, quietly work in your favor, versus the ones a caseworker is trained to flag. The system is not designed to be generous, and no video changes that. But knowing exactly how it works is the one asset nobody can means test, take a charge against, or value at a discount. Hold on to that, and subscribe to Arthur's UK Retirement Guide, because there is more of this to get right before it ever becomes urgent.